In this news roundup of the week on the 8th of April 2022, the war in Ukraine shifts to the southeast as atrocities against civilians are being revealed. The UK government launches its bold and ambitious energy security policy, at least that's what they say. And France suddenly faces the possibility of being the site of the next big populist political upset, as Marine Le Pen surges at the last minute in the French election. My name is Mallen Baker, this is the Mallen Baker Show. This week, the war continued in Ukraine, and although I could have started with that sentence any time over the last couple of months, this week didn't just continue, it shifted very much into a new phase. The Russian military pulled relatively quickly from its positions in the vicinity of Kyiv, and the focus for attention shifted to the south and the east of the country. And this is where things are going to get particularly intense. Nobody should presume that how the story has gone to date, Russian missteps on the ground, Ukrainian resistance proving decisive, that is necessarily how the story is going to continue going. Not least because you would expect Putin to throw whatever possible at this stage, because it is the only hope to emerge from this exercise able to claim at least a partial victory, while of course pretending that this was all you ever wanted to achieve in the first place. If Russia can consolidate that pink area, and if it's really successful, extend it over to swallow up Odessa, thereby cutting Ukraine off from the Black Sea, then that will have been a significant set of territory gains. Whether the international community would allow the normalisation of such an outcome, we will just have to see, particularly as the Russian retreat has exposed some of the brutal outcomes that have been meted out to significant numbers of civilians that fell under their control. Russian claims that video footage of such atrocities have been faked were never credible to begin with, but in any case were quickly disproven with the use of open source intelligence techniques, including satellite imaging and various image analysis techniques. And you can see the progress of these narratives unfolding in real time. So this morning, we got the news that there was a dual missile strike on the Kramatorsk railway station. 2 missiles, identified as Toshka-U guided missiles, hit the station, which at the time was packed with civilians trying to flee the area on account of it being expected to become the major focus for future fighting. Video footage showed the missile launches, suggesting that they came from the pro-Russian controlled Shakarsk, although it's too early to say for sure that those were the same missiles. Nevertheless, it seems pretty certain that the missiles came from the Russian military, because shortly after they'd hit, Russian sources were boasting that they'd hit railway targets. The Russian journalist Dmitry Steshin, for one, who shared information on Telegram, claiming that the missile strike had hit the station due to, quote, the accumulation of militants. Another Russian Twitter account announced this: in the Donetsk region, at 3 railway stations, missiles from the air destroyed weapons and military equipment of the reserves of Ukrainian troops that arrived in the Donbass, signed the Ministry of Defense of Russia. However, as soon as it became clear that actually there had been an accumulation of refugees and some pretty horrific and graphic photos of the aftermath emerged, those posts began to disappear. And the official Russian state media claimed that Ukrainian forces had attacked the station because it's Friday or something. So here's that same Russian account now saying this: the Russian Defense Ministry denied Kiev's claims of involvement in the strike on Kramatorsk. The thing is that for anyone who cares about the truth, it has been notable how desperate and feeble the attempts at an alternative narrative have actually been. Because there are almost always now multiple sources of evidence, and there are growing numbers of people skilled in using open source and freely available tools such as satellite imaging to verify what is actually valid and what is fake. So for instance, when there's a video that does cut the other way, and we saw a second one emerge this week with footage of Ukrainian soldiers killing hostage Russian soldiers, The location's quickly ascertained, there are faces that can be used for reverse image search and other techniques for identification, and various other clues to quickly establish that yes, this footage is valid. And at that point this week, the Ukrainian government again accepted the evidence and promised to investigate. A promise that they can be held to, because at least we're all dealing with real events and real consequences. Meanwhile, all Russian state TV is left with is the knowledge that it can still effectively fool the captive Russian population who have no information sources other than their broadcasts. So for instance, here, that very same state TV is showing video that has been identified as coming from behind the scenes footage from a Russian TV series. But they're claiming that it shows Ukrainians faking corpses for the scene of a staged attack. Easily debunked and yet perfectly effective if the audience never gets exposure to the debunking. Mind you, there are some realities that are harder to hide, and that particularly comes in the form of Russian soldiers not returning from the war. Previously, part of the information flow had been to downplay the number of Russian casualties, but by all accounts, they have been so substantial that it's really not going to hold with all of those bereaved families. So Putin's spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that there had been significant losses, telling the British channel Sky News that these were a huge tragedy for Russia. He was speaking in the wake of Russia having been ejected from the United Nations Human Rights Council on Wednesday, a symbolic act more than anything, since it's Russia's place on the Security Council of the UN that is really the most powerful thing. The Russian UN ambassador Gennady Kuzmin nevertheless denounced the vote to remove them as illegitimate and politically motivated, and then basically said, "You can't eject us, we quit." Worth noting that China voted against the motion to expel them rather than simply abstaining as it had with some other recent votes. China's UN ambassador Zhang Jun said this: "Such a hasty move at the General Assembly, which forces countries to choose sides, will aggravate the division among member states and intensify the confrontation between the parties concerned. It is like adding fuel to the fire." The other factor with all of this, of course, is the practical consequences that are hitting everybody, and particularly right now in the area of energy security. In the UK this week, the government launched a significant policy update on that energy security, which had some big moves, driven by the stark realisation of how much needs to be done and how quickly in order to become less vulnerable to the global supply chain issues. We will come to that in just a minute. But first, the launch this week of the third IPCC report on climate change, the final part of the current cycle, went mostly unremarked. Partly because, there's a war on, and an energy crisis, and maybe the potential for World War III. All of those things are capturing people's attentions right now. Partly also because the media only ever reports the same thing about any of these reports. How urgent it all is, and how it's code red for humanity, and how we need to take action right now, etc., etc. There's lots of detail and nuance in the reports, some of which is genuinely worth being talked about, but it's rarely the nuance that generates headlines, and the same headlines over and over doesn't count as news. One of the things the report did talk about was the need, under all scenarios, for large-scale carbon capture. We talk about net zero because it's impossible to get to actual zero because some technologies will continue to have an impact on any timescale we can envisage, so there needs to be some way to remove a certain percentage of CO2 to offset those emissions. But what does that actually look like? How realistic is it? Because a bunch of the campaigners say it's totally unproven technology, therefore dangerous to rely on and unrealistic. Are they right? What is the state of the art right now? I will be looking at that in the next deep dive video to go live on this channel on Monday next week, the 11th of April, going live at 7 PM UK time, so join me for that. The British Energy Security Strategy was launched this week. It had some eye-catching features and in equal part raised some major questions. So right now in the UK, electricity is generated by a range of sources, 40% gas, the current high cost of which is pummeling the nation in multiple ways. 21% wind, 15% nuclear, 4% solar, 3% oil, 2% coal, 2% hydropower. The government said its aim is to reduce that gas volume by 40% within 8 years, in other words by 2030. And to do that by boosting offshore wind massively, 380% up from the current capacity, to boost nuclear power massively to get to a target of a quarter of electricity consumption by 2050, to boost solar power massively by 5 times by 2035, to boost the previous target for hydrogen significantly, doubling it from 5 gigawatts by 2030 to 10 gigawatts, and to remove coal and oil from the grid totally by 2030. There were howls of protest from environmentalists because there was no new money for investment in making homes more energy efficient. And there were howls of protest from many, but not all, environmentalists who are opposed to nuclear power. The renewables industry was pretty happy though, as was the nuclear industry. Some of the pushback was built into the brief. An energy security policy is about one highly pertinent question: how do we get the country out of a massive hole that it's allowed itself to drift into, where it's dependent on external energy sources that we can expect to continue to be volatile over the medium term. It was never feasibly going to be the case that answering that question would satisfactorily also answer the question about how people are going to cope with higher prices in the very short term. And that's because easy short-term answers don't really exist to a major systemic problem. Opposition parties said that, but if you insulate people's homes, then very quickly you reduce the costs for the poorest people. And that had been on the table, and it was a former government policy, and there is some existing money for that. But it was vetoed by the Treasury, as we understand it. And it's an open question. The arguments against, I presume, go along the lines of, first, it may quickly reduce the burden for the households that get free insulation, sure, but how many will really be able to get that in the short term? Getting that to scale is incredibly difficult, so it's then of zero benefit to all of the other households that don't get covered by the scheme in the next 12 months, and yet the government is borrowing more money after an expensive pandemic to put into areas that cannot provide any kind of return. So it just becomes something that has to be paid back over time with higher taxes and or less money for something else that you would probably want equally as much. And this is what the government has said. It could not afford merely to rely on taxpayer funding to assist with ever higher bills. Householders needed to take actions themselves to bring bills down, it said. Whereas what the government is doing now is investing in the areas where its input can make investments by the private sector safer and more attractive, which will turn into future key infrastructure that will help to deliver returns to the country, as well as, of course, to the companies. The case for the other side is that, well, yeah, that's all well and good, but if energy prices are high right now, that is largely down to government mistakes over the last couple of decades. Failing to push fast enough on decarbonising energy sources, failing to actually deliver on promises for new nuclear power stations, and really just putting off every difficult decision for the long term in order to avoid short-term costs. So since government has helped to create the vulnerability, maybe it owes some sort of duty to the people who have been hit the hardest by the massive costs that the government has helped to create to help them survive them. And the most cost-effective way to do that will be to give them insulation, because once it's installed, the benefits are long-lasting for no additional cost. Those are arguments that fall along a traditional left-right political divide, and you can pick your side and join the debate. Personally, I would vote for a pragmatic version of either, so long as the work has been done on getting the details right, getting the balance to achieve the goal. The key question really is whether the government can actually deliver on its so-called bold vision. So on nuclear power, Boris Johnson said this: "We're bringing nuclear home with one nuclear plant, one nuclear reactor every year for 8 years, rather than one a decade." Yeah, well, maybe. Some scepticism is in order, you would have to think. Governments have often, through recent history, promised a renaissance in nuclear power, only for not much to actually emerge in practice. Now, you could possibly break that logjam if you were utterly serious, utterly committed, highly competent in navigating all the detail needed to make it happen, robust in the face of all of the significant costs and the political pushback that will inevitably follow. Just on a practical level, it's not a description of the government as we've experienced it to date. Now, maybe that's about to change. Maybe the war in Ukraine has shocked them all awake and they are now focused on the task in hand. But just minutes ago, it felt they were blundering around and bumping into stationary objects, so it would be a remarkable transformation. Some of the other details, early thoughts about doubling onshore wind capacity have been backed away from, reportedly from pushback from conservative backbenchers who don't really want to see new turbines in their constituencies. It's still an open question whether hydrogen, which is most needed for heavy industry that currently needs to use fossil fuels for processes such as steel manufacture or cement making, whether it could be used to replace natural gas in home heating. So there's been a pilot of 650 homes in the village of Winlayton, which has been given a 20% hydrogen, 80% natural gas blend. Hydrogen molecules are a lot smaller than methane ones, so there had been some concern that it might leak more from the existing gas infrastructure that wasn't built to contain it. But the pilot seems to suggest that there hasn't been a problem with that, at least not so far. There's also the fact that hydrogen has less energy per weight than methane, only about a third as much energy, in fact. And that has apparently not been especially noticeable within a 20% blend. But the point is that it does reduce the amount of gas savings that are made because you needed to use more of the blend than you would for the pure gas. Now, does any of that make sense? The manufacture of hydrogen is very energy inefficient. Converting energy into hydrogen and then back again at the point of use, a lot of energy is lost along the way. There's a strong temptation to try to make it work because of the hope that you could just use the existing infrastructure of gas pipeworks to power large numbers of homes, which then don't need to be converted to an alternative system such as electric heat pumps. But the world generally is at a standing start with hydrogen at any sort of scale. So it seems pretty unlikely you're going to get that sort of scale on an accelerated timescale that's going to make sense. Oh, the other aspect that environmentalists hated was the fact that new oil and gas licenses for the North Sea may be forthcoming. The arguments are that since the progress towards net zero still involves using lots of fossil fuels, albeit on a diminishing tapered basis, and locally produced gas from the North Sea carries a lower footprint and has greater security as well than that imported from overseas, then we should make the most of what we've got. 560 billion cubic metres of gas are thought to remain in reserves under the North Sea. The government also highlights that the gas and oil companies are amongst those using those fossil fuel profits to invest heavily in the zero carbon technologies of the future, particularly hydrogen and carbon capture. And this is the part that traditional environmentalists hate the most. They really don't want a zero carbon future where oil and gas companies get to play and to be a profitable supplier of the technologies of the future. No, they want them defeated, destroyed, hauled up before an international court for ecocide crimes that are not currently crimes, mostly for doing things that we demanded of them, while yes, they ignored some evidence which all other societal institutions were aware of and were ignoring as well. Generally, this will work better if you provide a vision that people will want to vote for and make it equally attractive to those with the money to invest in it. cramming down a vision of deprivation that people don't want, overthrowing all the companies that have experience of pushing technologies to scale. Those are, at the very least, the more difficult road to follow. You could describe it more forthrightly still if you were so minded. Meanwhile, elsewhere, a big political moment is on the horizon, possibly anyway, because France goes to the polls in a few days, and for months it was presumed that even though large numbers of the French voters are seriously hacked off with President Macron, he would still easily be re-elected. In the final few days before polling, though, the prospect has emerged that the populist leader of the National Rally Party, Marine Le Pen, could snatch the prize from him at the last minute. Le Pen has spent much time over the last decade seeking to ease what had proudly been a far-right party sufficiently towards the centre that it might be recast as a respectable option. A process that saw plenty of her colleagues, those that were committed to their position, including her predecessor and coincidentally father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, criticising her for abandoning the true path. Historically, the French system, which is a two-part election process for most bodies, has worked in order to keep the extremists out. And we saw it most recently in 2017, when it worked once again against Le Pen, who did well enough in the first round to make it through to the final runoff between the top two candidates. But at that point, traditionally, all of the centre and the left voters would coalesce around the other person on the ballot, whoever it might be, to keep the extremist out. And so they did. Having come within 3% of Macron in the first round voting, Le Pen lost to him in the second round by a large 2-1 margin. Two things seem to have changed. One, Le Pen has kept the populist appeal for those worried about immigration, about high crime and on a range of other questions, but has made at least some voters reconsider whether she is now respectable enough to win their vote. This has been helped, ironically, by the rise of more uncompromising candidates like Eric Zemmour, whose presence in the campaign has helped to make Le Pen look moderate in comparison. And two, this year, maybe because of a pandemic, maybe because of Macron's image, and the fact that he was so sure of himself he didn't even begin campaigning until almost the very end of the process, a higher percentage seems to have become uninterested in the election and unlikely to vote at all. A smaller voting pool tends to favour the more populist candidates whose voters can be guaranteed to be more motivated and more enthusiastic. A recent article on the Politico website suggested that if not particularly interested was a candidate, it would win hands down. But with the candidates actually on the ballot, Le Pen is polling extremely close to Macron in the prospect of a repeat of that runoff election. Of course, regardless of whether or not Le Pen has made real progress in detoxifying her brand, a win for her would probably create a moral panic across the European Union. Even a watered-down Le Pen is generally pro-Putin, and although she's dropped the idea of France leaving the EU, she's not exactly a fan. From Macron fancying himself as the senior statesman of Europe in a post-Angela Merkel world, to France being semi-disconnected, that would be a major breach. That said, the French system seems unlikely to deliver any equivalent effect when it comes to voting for the French Parliament, where Le Pen's party is almost completely absent. So whatever her sentiments about domestic policy, for instance her wish to dismantle all the wind farms to focus instead on a renewal in the nuclear industry, she would be severely constrained in what she could actually do in the face of a hostile legislature. That wouldn't stop her from making her influence felt strongly on foreign policy, of course. Exactly what the EU would most fear, in fact. As things currently stand, the probabilities are still with an ultimate Macron victory, albeit with a significantly weakened mandate. But as we've seen before, polls can often understate support for populist candidates. And Macron's late campaign has been struggling with revelations that during his tenure, 2.7 billion euros was spent on consultants, particularly McKinsey. Whatever policy he puts forward now, his opponents simply ask whether or not it came from McKinsey, which is a great campaigning line if you consider McKinsey are alleged to have paid zero tax in France over 10 years, despite sales of €329 million. Now, the firm denies it, but French financial prosecutors have opened preliminary tax fraud investigations into global management consultancies generally, so those that want to believe will do so anyway. And whether they're right or not will only be resolved after the election. In other words, in the next few weeks, pretty much anything could happen. The final runoff will be on April the 24th. The date of a Trump-level upset in European politics, or the weary and jaded triumph of the status quo? Watch this space. There are times when the simple fact of being committed to the truth can feel a bit overwhelming. I mean, this week has just been full of examples. Russia arguing that pictures of death and destruction are all fakes, and that Ukrainians just keep punching themselves in the face with heavy weapons and stuff. While on another thread, you can have climate campaigners arguing that the latest IPCC report says that, for example, quote, "Our civilization is in free fall and our planet will soon be unlivable," which is not what it says, obviously. And he's just the counterweight to the fact-free people on the other side, of course. So, like this piece. Oh, there's actually a pause in warming. Indeed, there's now a slight cooling. But even the graph being used in that article doesn't support the claim if you look at the detail of what it's actually showing. Doesn't matter, because the audience never looks that closely. There have been various other examples on a range of different topics. The new ivermectin study, people on one side or the other, all sorts. Working out what's actually true for any one of them is an interesting project. When they're all coming at you at once, you can feel tempted to throw up your hands. This, of course, is exactly the point. The aim can be to overwhelm you with so much contrary narrative that it pushes people into the frame of mind that says it's too much. I now no longer quite trust that I know what's real anymore. Or even, and most corrosively, maybe nothing is true anymore. Maybe it's all just down to your perspective. Well, no. The truth matters because all of these things have real life consequences. The answers may often be messy, open to valid productive skepticism, hard to actually nail down. But let's at least draw a deep breath and reaffirm one thing. Yes, there is such a thing as truth and reality. Yes, outcomes will generally be better when we commit to finding it. Remember, nothing worthwhile gets achieved without overcoming obstacles. You might as well enjoy the process, because that is the process. And as we constantly discover, obstacles come in all shapes and sizes. This week's live stream was demonetized by YouTube, I noticed. I'm guessing because it included discussion of Boris Johnson's latest comments about trans issues. Maybe, might have been something else. Anyway, I checked again today and it had been magically reinstated. So it's just a reminder that the bots and the algorithms can get a little random at the best of times, throwing up random obstacles. Which is just one reason, of course, why I am thankful for the people who support this channel on Patreon. I will do live streams and other videos and talk about whatever the heck seems to be interesting and important, knowing that regardless what YouTube chooses to do about that, there is still that brilliant group of people who want this channel to succeed, who want me to look at all of these questions without fear nor favour. If you would like to join that group, to add your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce here, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, What are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.